It wasn't announced with trumpets or formal declarations. It arrived as a quiet, devastating directive, one that erased Princess Beatrice from succession conversations and struck Prince Andrew's name from internal royal records entirely. Those who saw the document described it as surgical. Those who didn't were never meant to know. But behind palace walls, the message was unmistakable. The line had been redrawn, and there was no going back. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The document itself never surfaced publicly, at least not in full, yet reports suggest it circulated swiftly among the highest levels of palace administration, passed from one trusted hand to another with an urgency that immediately raised alarms. It wasn't just its existence that unsettled those who encountered it, it was the tone, cold, precise, unemotional. This was not a warning, not a temporary measure, but something far more final. Language within the memorandum, according to insiders, didn't speak of suspension or distancing. It spoke of permanence, of removal, of a structural adjustment that would quietly but fundamentally reshape the internal mechanics of royal succession planning. And at the center of this unfolding shift stood Princess Anne, the monarchy's most unyielding enforcer, long respected and sometimes feared for her uncompromising loyalty to duty, was said to be leading the charge. Insiders whisper that this wasn't an impulsive reaction, but a calculated execution, something she had been preparing for, perhaps even anticipating. Her involvement signaled that this was no ordinary internal correction. This was what some within royal circles have begun to describe as an institutional reset, one that prioritized stability over sentiment, duty over blood. Prince Andrew's absence from key strategic discussions became noticeable almost immediately, though never publicly acknowledged. Meetings that once included his input quietly proceeded without him. Briefings were adjusted, invitations reconsidered. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. A gradual erasure that, by design, avoided spectacle but delivered undeniable impact. And then there was Princess Beatrice. Her position, once seen as secure within the broader framework of the royal future, suddenly shifted into uncertainty. Described in internal language as under review, her role became ambiguous, caught between legacy and consequence. What made this moment even more chilling was the silence surrounding it. Palace aides, typically adept at managing narratives, were reportedly instructed to say nothing. Not a denial, not a clarification, just silence. And in the world of the monarchy, silence often speaks louder than any statement. Media insiders began to pick up on subtle inconsistencies, missed appearances, altered seating arrangements, shifts in tone. Something was happening, they sensed. Something deliberate. Those closest to the situation began to use words like irreversible and triggered, suggesting that whatever had set this process in motion had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. And while the public remained largely unaware, behind closed doors, the implications were already being felt. Relationships strained, loyalties tested, the quiet hum of palace life disrupted by an undercurrent of tension that refused to settle. But this wasn't a sudden decision, it was the culmination of tensions building quietly for years. Long before the decree surfaced, concerns had already begun to ripple through the institution. Not loudly, but persistently. Questions about legacy, optics, and public trust were no longer confined to tabloids. They had entered the palace itself. And when those questions reached Princess Anne, the monarchy's most uncompromising enforcer, the response was never going to be passive. At first, it was subtle. A shift in tone during internal discussions. A hesitation where once there had been certainty. Reports suggest that senior aides began raising quiet concerns about how certain associations were being perceived beyond palace gates. Not in dramatic terms, not in accusations, but in careful, measured language that hinted at something deeper. The monarchy, as it has always been framed within its own walls, was never meant to operate as a family entitlement. It was, and remains, a sacred trust, something held not for personal comfort, but for public stability. And when that trust is perceived to be under strain, even slightly, the response is rarely immediate, but it is always inevitable. Princess Beatrice, by all accounts, found herself at the center of this growing unease, not because of any singular action, but because of proximity. Proximity to a figure whose standing had already become complicated, whose presence in the institution had long been under quiet scrutiny. Insiders whisper that this connection, though familial and deeply personal, began to raise difficult questions in rooms where sentiment is often overshadowed by strategy. How close is too close? How much association is acceptable before perception begins to shift into liability? These were not questions asked publicly, but they were asked again and again behind closed doors. What made the situation more complex was the division among senior royals themselves. Some, according to various interpretations of internal conversations, believed that distance had already been established and that further action risked appearing excessive. Others, however, saw the issue not as resolved, but as lingering an unresolved thread that could, at any moment, unravel into something far more damaging. And within that divide, tension began to grow. Quiet at first, then more pronounced. Not confrontational, but unmistakable. Hovering over all of this was the enduring influence of Queen Elizabeth II. Even in absence, her long-term vision continued to shape decisions, her philosophy echoing through every discussion about continuity and preservation. Those familiar with her approach often reference a single guiding principle: the institution must outlast the individual. And it is within that framework that the current generation has been operating, weighing every choice not against emotion, but against legacy. What protects the crown? What ensures its survival not just today, but decades from now? It is here that the influence of Prince William and Princess Anne becomes impossible to ignore. Together, they represent a form of continuity different in style, but aligned in purpose. William, the future, carrying the weight of what is to come. Anne, the constant, enforcing the standards that have defined the monarchy for generations. Reports suggest their roles in internal decision-making have grown significantly, not through declaration, but through necessity. And with that influence comes a sharper focus, a lower tolerance for ambiguity, and a willingness to act where hesitation once lingered. As these forces converged, public perception, internal division, inherited doctrine, and emerging leadership, the atmosphere within the palace shifted from concern to calculation. The questions were no longer hypothetical. They were immediate, pressing, and increasingly difficult to ignore. Because in an institution built on continuity, even the smallest crack can carry consequences far beyond its origin. And those watching closely began to realize that something was building, something that would not remain contained much longer. Then came the moment insiders now describe as the true turning point. Something happened, something never formally disclosed, yet widely whispered about in royal circles. It wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense, but rather a breach of expectation, a line crossed. And according to those familiar with internal discussions, it triggered a chain reaction that could no longer be contained. It began, as many turning points within the monarchy do, with a meeting that was never meant to carry consequence beyond its walls. A private gathering, limited attendees, no official record. And yet, reports suggest that what unfolded in that room shifted the trajectory of everything that followed. Those familiar with the exchange describe a tone that quickly moved from routine to tense, from controlled to quietly confrontational, not through raised voices but through implications, through suggestions that something previously settled might not be as final as it seemed. At the center of this tension were alleged attempts, subtle but unmistakable, to reopen conversations many believed had already been closed. Prince Andrew's name, long absent from strategic considerations, was reportedly mentioned again. Not as a formal proposal, not as a demand, but as a possibility, a question posed carefully, perhaps even cautiously. But in an institution governed by precedent and perception, even suggestion carried weight. It was enough to unsettle those who had worked meticulously to create distance, enough to reignite concerns that had only just begun to quiet. Princess Beatrice's presence in these discussions, according to insiders, added another layer of complexity. She was not seen as the instigator, but her involvement, her proximity to the conversation placed her in a position that blurred the lines between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. And within the monarchy, those lines are not meant to blur. They are meant to hold, firm, clear, unquestioned. When they don't, even briefly, it raises questions that cannot easily be dismissed. What followed was not immediate action, but a shift in atmosphere that those inside the palace recognized instantly. The phrase protocol boundaries began to surface in internal conversations quietly at first, then with increasing frequency. It wasn't an accusation. It was a warning, a signal that something had moved beyond what was acceptable, even if only by a fraction. And in a system where precision defines stability, even the smallest deviation can feel like a fracture. Palace aides, sensing the sensitivity of the moment, were reportedly instructed to contain the situation, limit information, avoid speculation, maintain silence. But silence, in this case, only deepened the intrigue. Because while official channels remained quiet, the absence of clarification began to draw attention. Media insiders, particularly those closely aligned with royal reporting, started to notice the shift. The lack of leaks, the absence of narrative control, the unusual stillness from correspondents who are rarely without insight. It was, in its own way, louder than any headline. And beneath that silence, the realization began to settle among those closest to the institution. Something had been triggered, not a scandal, not a crisis in the traditional sense, but a moment of reckoning, a point at which internal patience gave way to decisive consideration. Because if boundaries could be tested once, they could be tested again. And if that possibility existed, then the response could no longer be passive. The monarchy does not move quickly, but when it moves, it does so with intent. And in this case, the groundwork had already been laid. The concerns had been voiced. The lines had been crossed, however subtly. All that remained was the response. And when it came, it would not be loud. It would not be public. But it would be unmistakable. That was when Princess Anne stepped in and everything changed. Princess Anne does not react, she executes. And when she invoked what insiders now call the Iron Protocol, the outcome was never in doubt. Quiet, methodical, and absolute, the process began not with confrontation, but with documentation. What made this moment so decisive was not its visibility, but its structure. According to reports circulating within palace administrative circles, the response was never intended to be emotional or reactive. It was designed to be systematic. A strict internal review mechanism was quietly activated, one that would examine not just recent events, but patterns, associations, decisions, positioning within the broader framework of royal duty. This was not about a single meeting or a single misstep. It was about alignment. And whether that alignment still held. Prince Edward, often described as the monarchy's quiet legal sentinel, was reportedly drawn into the process early. His role, as insiders suggest, was not to confront but to interpret, to ensure that every step taken was grounded in established frameworks, particularly those tied to succession and constitutional structure. Legal advisors, operating behind closed doors, began revisiting documents that are rarely discussed outside the highest levels of royal governance. References to letters patent, those formal instruments that define and redefine royal roles, started to surface in internal conversations, not as threats, but as tools, mechanisms through which the institution could recalibrate itself without spectacle. And that was the defining characteristic of the Iron Protocol. It did not rely on public statements or visible action. It moved through administrative channels, quietly adjusting, quietly redefining. Invitations were reviewed, roles reassessed, access reconsidered. Each decision on its own might have seemed minor, but together they formed something far more significant. A gradual restructuring that left little room for ambiguity. Those within the system began to feel it not as a sudden shift, but as a tightening, a narrowing of space. At the same time, a quiet alliance was taking shape. Prince William, already stepping more firmly into his role as future monarch, was said to be closely aligned with Anne's approach. Different in demeanor, perhaps, but united in principle. The idea that the institution must come before individual ties was not new, but in this moment, it became operational. It moved from philosophy to action. Insiders began repeating a phrase that captured the essence of what was unfolding: duty over blood, not as a slogan, but as a directive. What made this alliance so powerful was its balance. Anne, with her unwavering adherence to tradition. William, with his forward-looking sense of responsibility. Together, they represented continuity past and future, working in unison to protect the present. And within that unity, there was clarity. No hesitation. No internal contradiction. just a shared understanding that the situation required more than caution. It required resolution. As the process unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this was not about punishment. It was about definition, about drawing lines that could not be blurred again. Every administrative action, every reviewed document, every adjusted role contributed to a larger objective, restoring coherence to a system that had begun to show signs of strain. And while the outside world remained largely unaware, those within the palace understood exactly what was happening. Because the Iron Protocol was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt, in absence, in silence, in the subtle but undeniable shift of structure. And by the time its full effect became apparent, it was already complete. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was devastating in its precision. There was no confrontation, no public fallout, just silence and then absence. Names removed, invitations withdrawn, access quietly revoked. By the time anyone outside the inner circle noticed, the process was already complete. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. A missing name on a briefing document, a revised guest list that raised no immediate suspicion, a meeting that proceeded without certain individuals who had once been considered essential to its structure. Reports suggest these adjustments were not random, nor were they temporary. They followed a pattern quiet, consistent, and deliberate. Prince Andrew's presence, once embedded within layers of internal planning, began to dissolve. Not through announcement, but through omission. A slow but unmistakable removal from the mechanisms that define influence within the monarchy. For Princess Beatrice, the shift was more complex, and in many ways, more emotionally charged. Insiders whisper that her exclusion from future succession-related discussions was not framed as punishment, but as precaution. A distinction that may appear subtle on paper, yet carried profound implications in practice. Her role, once positioned within the broader narrative of continuity, was now being reevaluated through a different lens, one shaped not by lineage alone, but by association. And in a system where perception often outweighs intention, that association became impossible to ignore. Social and ceremonial roles, long considered the visible expression of royal standing, began to change as well. Invitations that once arrived as a matter of course became less frequent. Appearances were adjusted, scaled back, or quietly reassigned. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately draw public attention. But enough to create distance. Enough to signal, to those watching closely, that something had shifted beneath the surface. The monarchy, it seemed, was redefining its boundaries not loudly, but with precision. Behind the scenes, the transformation was even more pronounced. Key palace systems, those that manage protocol, hierarchy, and internal access, were reportedly updated to reflect a new structure. These are not systems the public ever sees, but they are the backbone of how the institution operates. To be altered within them is to be repositioned in a way that cannot easily be reversed. It is here, in these quiet adjustments, that the true weight of the decision became clear. Because once codified, such changes do not fade. They endure. And within the York family, the emotional toll of this shift began to surface, though never publicly acknowledged. Reports of strains, subtle, carefully worded, started to circulate among those familiar with the situation. Not conflict, not confrontation, but a quiet tension. The kind that settles in when circumstances change faster than they can be processed. When roles that once felt certain become uncertain. When the future, once clearly defined, begins to blur. Public-facing appearances, too, became noticeably limited. Not absent, but reduced. Calibrated. Each engagement, each moment of visibility, seemed to carry a new level of scrutiny, not from the public alone, but from within. As if every detail was being measured against a standard that had quietly shifted. And for those affected, the realization must have been gradual, yet inescapable. This was not a pause. It was a redefinition. What made it all the more chilling was the absence of resistance. No public objection. No visible pushback. Just acceptance or perhaps recognition that the process had moved beyond the point of negotiation. Because by the time the changes became visible, they were already embedded, already normalized within the structure they had reshaped. And as the implications of that restructuring began to ripple outward, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. This was not simply the result of internal disagreement. It was the execution of a decision that had already been made, already been set into motion, long before anyone outside the inner circle had the chance to question it. Even the king, sources suggest, could not stop what had already been set in motion. For King Charles III, the decision was never simple. Family and duty collided in ways that left little room for compromise, and while he may not have initiated the process, insiders suggest he ultimately allowed it to proceed for the sake of something far greater than any one individual. By the time the full scope of the internal restructuring reached him, much of it had already been set in motion. Reports suggest he was briefed not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle, when the framework was no longer theoretical, when the machinery of change had already begun to turn. It placed him in a position that was both powerful and strangely limited, because to intervene at that stage would not have been a simple reversal. It would have meant unraveling a process carefully constructed to protect the institution itself, and that is a weight no monarch carries lightly. Complicating everything further were his ongoing health struggles, which insiders say had quietly reshaped how decisions were being handled within the palace. Since early 2024, his focus had been divided not just between state duties and personal recovery, but between maintaining continuity and preserving strength. Those familiar with internal dynamics suggest this created space for others, particularly Princess Anne and Prince William, to step forward with greater authority. Not in defiance, but in support. Not as challengers, but as guardians of a system that could not afford uncertainty. And in that environment, influence became subtle but decisive. Anne's unwavering adherence to duty, William's growing role as future sovereign together, they formed a quiet center of gravity that shaped the direction of events. Charles, it seems, was not excluded from this alignment, but he was no longer its sole driver. Instead, he found himself navigating a delicate balance, honoring familial bonds while recognizing the necessity of institutional clarity. A balance that offered no easy resolution. What followed was not a dramatic endorsement, nor a visible act of enforcement. It was something far quieter and perhaps far more revealing, a form of acceptance, not because the decision was easy, but because the alternative carried greater risk. Insiders whisper that he understood the implications, even if he did not voice them publicly, that he recognized the long-term consequences of inaction just as clearly as the immediate discomfort of action. And in that recognition, a choice was made not to stop the process, but to allow it to continue. The phrase "protecting the institution at all costs" began to surface more frequently in conversations surrounding the crown. Not as a justification, but as a guiding principle. Because the monarchy, as it has always been framed, is not built to serve individual narratives. It exists to endure, to remain stable even when the circumstances around it shift. And when that stability is perceived to be under threat, the response, however difficult, becomes unavoidable. For Charles, this meant accepting a reality that few outside the institution can fully understand. That sometimes preservation requires distance. That sometimes continuity demands sacrifice. And that sometimes the most powerful decision a monarch can make is the one they do not visibly enforce but quietly permit. As the process reached its final stages, the emotional weight of that decision lingered beneath the surface. Not expressed, not acknowledged, but present nonetheless. Because behind every structural shift lies a human cost, one that is rarely seen, but always felt. And in this case, that cost was measured not just in roles or titles, but in relationships redefined, boundaries redrawn, and a future reshaped in ways that could not be undone. And so, a new order began to take shape, one defined by clarity, not sentiment. With the dust settled, the structure of the monarchy looked subtly but unmistakably different. Lines once blurred were now sharply defined, and those who remained within the inner circle understood exactly what it meant to stay there. What had once been a complex web of overlapping roles and inherited expectations was now tightening into something far more deliberate. Reports suggest that at the center of this recalibration stood Prince William, whose position as the future of the monarchy had quietly but firmly solidified. This was not a sudden rise, nor an announcement marked by ceremony. It was a shift that had been building, gaining momentum through necessity, reinforced by circumstance, and now made unmistakably clear through action. His influence, once emerging, was now established. Not through assertion, but through alignment with those who had already begun reshaping the institution from within. At the same time, the concept of the working royal took on new weight. It was no longer just a label, it became a boundary. A definition of who remained actively within the operational core of the monarchy and who did not. Insiders whisper that this distinction, once flexible, was now being applied with far greater precision. Responsibilities were concentrated. Visibility became more intentional. And with that came a consolidation of influence among a smaller, more focused group. The message, though never formally stated, was clear. Participation required alignment, and alignment required accountability. That word, accountability, began to surface more frequently in both internal discussions and external messaging. Not as a reaction, but as a principle. The monarchy, long sustained by tradition, was now reinforcing its connection to public trust in a more direct way. Reports suggest that every decision, every role, every appearance was being viewed through a sharper lens. Not just in terms of protocol, but in terms of perception. Because in a modern context, perception is no longer secondary, it is central. And maintaining that trust required more than silence. It required structure. Within this evolving framework, the York branch found itself increasingly distant from the institution's core. Not removed entirely, but repositioned. Their presence, once integrated into the broader narrative, became more peripheral. Appearances were fewer, involvement more limited. And while no formal declaration marked this shift, its effects were undeniable. Those watching closely began to recognize a pattern, one that reflected not exclusion for its own sake, but a deliberate narrowing of the monarchy's active circle. Externally, the messaging remained consistent: unity, stability, continuity. These were the themes that defined the monarchy's public face, carefully maintained even as internal changes unfolded. But behind that consistency, there was an acknowledgement, quiet but firm, that what had occurred was more than routine adjustment. It was, as some insiders have described, a corrective shift. A moment where the institution recalibrated itself, not in response to crisis, but in anticipation of it. And that anticipation is what gives this moment its lasting significance. Because the monarchy is not designed to react, it is designed to endure. To anticipate challenges before they fully emerge. To adjust its structure in ways that prevent instability rather than respond to it. And in this case, the adjustments were not temporary. They were foundational. They redefined not just roles, but expectations. Not just positions, but principles. For those within the inner circle, the implications were unmistakable. The path forward had been clarified. The standards had been reinforced. And the cost of misalignment had been demonstrated not through confrontation, but through absence. Through the quiet but powerful act of repositioning. But beyond the strategy and silence, one message stood above all. In the end, there were no speeches, no explanations, just a quiet, unmistakable outcome. The monarchy had drawn its line not in anger, but in principle. And those who understood its history knew exactly what it meant. Because beneath all the silence, beneath the carefully measured adjustments, and the absence of public confrontation, what had truly been reaffirmed was something far older than any current conflict. The monarchy, as it has long been understood within its own walls, is not simply a family bound by blood. It is a structure, a responsibility, a sacred trust carried across generations, shaped by those who came before and guarded by those who remain. And when that trust is tested even subtly, the response is never about individuals alone. It is about preservation. This moment, quiet as it appeared, forced a reckoning with a fundamental truth. Position within the monarchy has never been unconditional. It has always required alignment with duty, with expectation, with the invisible weight of history that defines every role. Reports suggest that what unfolded behind closed doors was not just a response to a single situation, but a broader reaffirmation of that principle. That proximity to the crown does not guarantee permanence. That legacy must be matched by responsibility. And that when the balance between the two begins to shift, the institution will act not loudly, but decisively. The cost of misalignment, as it became increasingly clear, was not expressed through punishment or public condemnation. It was expressed through absence, through the quiet removal of roles, the subtle redefinition of presence, the gradual distancing that spoke louder than any declaration ever could. Those affected were not cast out in dramatic fashion, but neither were they retained within the core. And in that space between inclusion and exclusion, the message became unmistakable. The monarchy does not need to explain itself to enforce its boundaries. It simply enforces them. What makes this moment particularly significant is how it echoes a principle that has guided the institution for generations: the firm before the family, a phrase rarely spoken aloud, yet deeply embedded in the monarchy's internal logic. It is the understanding that the institution must endure beyond personal relationships, beyond individual circumstances, beyond even the most difficult of choices. And in this case, that principle was not just remembered, it was applied. Quietly, firmly, without hesitation. For those within the royal structure, the implications will linger long after. The immediate changes have settled, because what has been demonstrated is not just a willingness to act, but a clarity of purpose. A reminder that the monarchy is not static, it evolves, adjusts, and, when necessary, corrects itself. Not in response to pressure, but in anticipation of it. Not to satisfy the present, but to secure the future. And for future generations, the message is already written into the fabric of this moment. That legacy is not a guarantee, it is a responsibility. That proximity to power requires discipline. And that the crown, for all its symbolism, operates on principles that are both unforgiving and essential. Because once those principles are compromised, even slightly, the consequences extend far beyond the individuals involved. So what remains is not conflict, not resolution in the traditional sense, but something far more enduring: clarity, a reassertion of what the monarchy stands for and what it will protect at all costs. And while the details may never be fully disclosed, the outcome speaks with unmistakable force. The line has been drawn. The structure has been reinforced, and the institution moves forward not unchanged, but strengthened by the very decisions that demanded so much from those within it. Because in the House of Windsor, legacy is not inherited, it is protected. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.